All right, today we're diving into what I think is the ultimate front door for your cloud applications, AWS API Gateway. Okay, so just think about your backend architecture for a second. You've probably got Lambda functions, maybe some servers on EC2, perhaps even a few third-party services you're calling. Trying to manage access, security, and all the traffic for each of those individually, yeah, it can get messy and fast. But what if you could have a single, super smart point of control for all of it? And that's exactly where AWS API Gateway steps in. At its heart, it's that single entry point we were just talking about. Because it's a fully managed service, AWS is handling all the tough infrastructure stuff for you. That means you can just focus on what you do best, building your API. It's really designed to handle the entire API lifecycle, from the moment you create it all the way through to monitoring. So let's kick things off by digging into how it really acts as that front door, the part that accepts all those incoming API calls. And when we say front door, we're talking about some serious scale. This isn't just a simple gate. It's a front door that can handle hundreds of thousands of requests at the same time, without even breaking a sweat. It's managing traffic, checking authorization, throttling requests, all of that good stuff, before a single request ever even gets near your backend. Okay, so a request shows up at this front door, but how does API Gateway know where it's supposed to go? To figure that out, let's take a look at the anatomy of a request and see exactly how it gets routed. So API Gateway basically looks at two main things to figure out where to send a request. First up is the resource path. That's just the part of the URL that says what the client is asking for, like /pets. The second piece is the HTTP method. Get to fetch data, post to create something new. It also has some really powerful shortcuts, like the any method, which is kind of like a wildcard, and a proxy resource that can catch all requests under a certain path. Super handy. Let's trace the journey, right? A request comes in, something like get/pet/123. API Gateway immediately looks for a matching path and method. Then, and this is a really, really important part, it can do some basic validation right there. So if a required parameter is missing, boom, it rejects the request on the spot. Your backend never even sees it. Think about that. It saves your backend from wasting time and money processing bad calls. Now, just because a request is valid doesn't mean it gets a free pass. Nope. Next up, it has to get past security. Let's talk about how API Gateway secures those gates. The main tool for this job is something called an authorizer. And honestly, the best way to think of it is like a bouncer at a club. It's usually a Lambda function that you write, and it's got one job: to look at the request and decide, should it be allowed in or should it be denied? And there are basically two main flavors of these Lambda authorizers. On one side, you got token-based authorizers. These are your go-to for standard stuff, like validating a bearer token. Simple. On the other side, you have request-based authorizers. These guys are way more flexible. They can poke around in the headers, the query strings, all sorts of request data to make much more detailed, custom decisions about who gets in. All right, so the request is valid. It's authorized. It's made it past the bouncer. Now, API Gateway can finally connect it to the actual backend service that's going to do the heavy lifting. And you've got a ton of options here. You can fire off a Lambda function directly, super common for serverless apps. You can just forward the request to any public HTTP endpoint out there. You can even integrate directly with other AWS services like DynamoDB. Oh, and there's also a mock integration, which is awesome for testing. It just returns a pre-made response without ever hitting a real backend. But here's the thing, API Gateway doesn't just pass the request along. This is where it gets really powerful. It can actually change the data on the fly as it passes through, using something called VTL, or Velocity Template Language. Okay, check this out. Let's say your client sends a JSON payload that looks like this, right? It's got separate fields for photographer_first name and photographer_last name. But what if your backend service is expecting a single combined field instead? Well, with VTL, API Gateway can transform that data into the new format before it even gets to your backend. And let me tell you, this is a huge deal. It means you can completely separate your client apps from your backend services. They don't have to speak the exact same language. That gives you some incredible flexibility in how you build things. But wait, the journey's not over. After the backend does its thing and sends a response back, API Gateway gets one last chance to work its magic on the return trip to the client. And one of the biggest ways it does that is with caching. I mean, just look at this chart. Without a cache, this request takes 123 milliseconds. But flick on API Gateway's caching and that latency drops to just 12 milliseconds for the next request. That is a massive performance win right there. So how does that work? Well, API Gateway can hold on to responses for a set amount of time, which takes a ton of load off your backend. And if a client needs the absolute latest data, they can just force a refresh. It's that simple. And on top of all that, if the client's browser can handle it, API Gateway will automatically compress the response, which saves you bandwidth and, you guessed it, more money. So we followed one single request from start to finish. But what about managing the entire API over time? I mean, the whole lifecycle. That's where we get into deployment and monitoring. And API Gateway gives you a complete toolkit for this stuff. You can deploy your API to different stages, like dev, test, and prod. You can set up usage plans to control how much different clients can use your API, with throttling and quotas. You can hand out API keys to control who gets access. And the best part? It all plugs right into CloudWatch and X-Ray, so you get amazing monitoring and tracing right out of the box. Now, this is a super important detail to remember for day-to-day operations. If you change the core structure of your API, like adding a new method or a resource, you have to do a full redeployment. But if you're just tweaking operational settings, things like throttling rules, custom domains, or API keys, you can do all of that on the fly, no redeployment needed. And that distinction is huge because it means you can manage your live API with a lot more agility. You can make common changes without any downtime at all. So, if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's that API Gateway isn't just some simple pass-through. Not at all. It's an intelligent, secure, and seriously scalable front door that manages the entire lifecycle of your API. It handles all that complexity for you so you can focus on the much bigger and way more exciting question, what are you going to build next?